Well, I think what we clearly heard from Donald Trump is never sell your Bitcoin. Big question was, does the United States sell Bitcoin? Does the United States buy Bitcoin? If you recall, the German government sold a lot of Bitcoin at $55,000 a Bitcoin. It turns out to be a more than $1 billion mistake in a couple of weeks. Big mistake. And people used to speculate, well, you know, is the government going to dump the Bitcoin? Are they not? And now what you see is Trump is pro-Bitcoin. And with the red sweep, that means the Republicans run the Senate, control the Senate, and they control the House, which means the pro-Bitcoin senators, like Senator Lummis, have now moved from being in the minority to being in the majority. In the minority, you watch the laws being written. In the majority, you write the laws, you pass the laws. Before November 5th, there was actually broad consensus in the House and the Senate to repeal SAB 121. And they did. And the president vetoed it. So what I would expect is that SAB 121 will be either withdrawn by the SEC or it will be repealed, and the president will support the repeal. That opens the way for banks to custody Bitcoin. That opens the way for the entire banking system to embrace Bitcoin. And I think for Bitcoin to grow by a factor of 100x from here, we need for the banking system of the world to support Bitcoin. So if I think about the consequences for Bitcoin, I think what this means is it's an acceleration of pro-Bitcoin regulations. I think that we'll see in-kind creation and redemption of Bitcoin ETFs. I think we'll see the repeal of SAB 121. I think we'll see support for Bitcoin within the banking system from the banking regulators, from Treasury, from OCC, from SEC. I think you'll see more supportive legislation from Congress. I think it will be approved by the White House. I think that this is a signal to accelerate institutional adoption. I think that the previous administration had been hostile to Bitcoin mining, hostile to Bitcoin banking, hostile to the Bitcoin ETFs, and the failure of Silicon Valley Bank followed by the shutdown, effectively the forcible liquidation of Silvergate and Signature, even though those were solvent banks. They were perfectly healthy banks that were actually forced into receivership by a hostile administration. I think that had caused the banking establishment, reasonably enough, to be skittish and to be conservative and a little bit slow to adopt Bitcoin because they could see there was resistance in the administration. Number one, it seems inconceivable to me that a head of the Treasury or the CFTC or the SEC will be appointed that is anti-Bitcoin or anti-crypto, right? That seems quite obvious. We know that Trump is all in on crypto, all in on Bitcoin. So I think that we'll have favorable, supportive cabinet members. I think the second thing is we know we'll have a supportive Congress. Congress was already in favor of Bitcoin, before November 5th. We'll have a supportive Senate. The Republican senators were already in favor of Bitcoin. The Democratic senators have been sidelined and won't have any power in this regard. So Elizabeth Warren's agenda is going to become largely a thing of the past and irrelevant in the White House, in the Senate, and the Congress of the future. So I think that all of this suggests an acceleration of institutional adoption. It's a signal that it's okay for insurance companies to think about insuring Bitcoin companies. It's a signal that it's okay for banks to bank Bitcoin and crypto companies. It's a signal that it's okay for Wall Street to start to embrace, endorse, and advocate Bitcoin, right? It's a signal that the president and the administration is going to look at things like Operation Choke Point as hostile to the interest of the industry. I think if you combine that with the pro-business and the pro-American agenda of the red wave, it's pretty clear that this administration wants to grow business in America. It wants to deregulate. It wants to strip away handcuffs. It wants to lower taxes. It wants to accelerate progress and then the passage to the future in the United States. And all of that, I think, is just very auspicious for Bitcoin and the digital assets industry.
One of Trump's campaign promises was to create a U.S. strategic Bitcoin stockpile. How quickly could we see something like that manifest, and what are the implications?
Now, the logic of the bill and the logic of the strategic Bitcoin reserve is simple. Buy the future, right? Once upon a time, the British looked to the New World and they realized the future was the New World. They came to the New World. It actually was the New World that powered the British Empire. That's why they won the Napoleonic Wars. That's why they were the greatest empire of the 17th, the 18th, the 19th century. They were fueled by the power of the New World, just like the Spanish Empire was fueled by the gold of the New World. Eventually, the 13 colonies realized they needed to go west, and as they expanded west, the United States grew into a formidable power. With the Louisiana Purchase, we doubled the landmass of the United States. Without the Louisiana Purchase, there would be no St. Louis. And that was a pretty good purchase. We did well there. That was Napoleon selling Louisiana to fund a war that he lost, and the U.S. doubling in size. What happened next was the acquisition of Texas, Nevada, the Western Territories, and California. Also going west again, it turned out to be a good trade. Made America, it created Hollywood. It created Silicon Valley, right? It gave America Apple and Google and Facebook and Amazon and movies and music and the Eagles and LA, and made us the cultural capital of the world. We acquired Alaska from the Russians. And it turned out that there were trillions of dollars of minerals and energy underneath Alaska. And that is manifest destiny. So nations grow by expanding into territories where they can generate extreme prosperity and productivity. And now there's nowhere further west to expand. The new frontier is cyberspace. You can't go west, you need to go up. You need to go into cyberspace. And Bitcoin is cyberspace. And the logic of the strategic Bitcoin reserve is, why don't we buy the future? Why don't we buy 20%, X%, anywhere from 5 to 25% of the future? And if the United States acquires 20% of cyberspace, then all of the capital from the past, from the 20th century, from the 19th century, the gold of the 19th century, the real estate, the bonds, the stocks of the 20th century, they're going to flow into the 21st century. That's the money that's going from traditional money to Bitcoin. And all of the capital from China and Russia and Africa and South America and Europe, it's going to flow into cyberspace. It's going to flow into Bitcoin. We're putting a flag in cyberspace where all the money in the world is about to head. And the logic is, we might as well get there before the rest of the world decides they need to settle. Bitcoin is the future world reserve capital network. And so should people decide that they want to move to the world reserve capital network, which is Bitcoin, the smartest thing for the United States is make sure they own that too. And so the beauty is, in the world post-Satoshi, money bifurcates into currency and capital. Mm-hmm. Currency is the medium of exchange. It's the legal tender. It's the dollar is the world reserve currency, and everything else in the world is pegged to the dollar. The Chinese currency is pegged to the dollar. The Emirati currency is pegged to the dollar. The euro is almost pegged to the dollar. One of the aspects of money is currency. The United States owns the world reserve currency.
Right.
It's a great advantage for us. The other aspect of money is capital, long-term store of value. I don't need to buy coffee with it. I don't need to pay my rent with it. I want to feed my family 100 years from now with it. I want to be rich forever with it. That capital, and the money in the form of capital, is a profoundly new idea, because the wealthy and the institutions, well, the wealthy have used real estate as capital for the past 100 years, or they've used stocks and S&P ETFs, indexes, as capital. And institutions, banks, and operating companies, they have used sovereign debt. They have used debt as capital. And now here's the big idea. The people that use real estate and equity as capital, Harvard University, Yale, rich people, Bill Gates, all the wealthy people in the world, every wealthy family, the people that used property or equity as capital, they're still rich. The people that use debt as capital, banks, the banks are insolvent. If you actually used sovereign debt as capital for the past 4 years, you have a minus 5% nominal yield.
Yeah.
Now, who else uses sovereign debt as capital? Operating companies. So public companies and banks, operating companies, are forced to use toxic capital, which is weak capital, I'll call it. The US dollar is great as a currency. It's not great as capital. All the Bitcoiners know this. We don't really empathize with the despair of a corporation or the despair of a bank. Sometimes we don't really empathize with them. But what about the despair of a bank, which is capitalized on a collapsing asset capital? What about the despair of a corporation? 1% of the companies in the S&P 500 make all the money. The others work hard. When I found Bitcoin, I was in despair. I had worked for a decade. I had spent 20,000 man years attempting to do everything under the sun. I could not get ahead.
Right.
And I was the same me. I wasn't stupid, right? You look at me and say, well, this is Michael Saylor, worked as hard as he could for a decade and could not get ahead, right? And the most pernicious thing you can do to someone is you make them think that they're just not smart enough, and the reason they're failing is because they're not smart and they don't work hard enough. And then you realize, no, the system is rigged against you. So what does this mean? What does the strategic Bitcoin reserve mean? It means that Bitcoin is hope for the people, but it means that once the United States embraces Bitcoin as the world's reserve capital network, and it builds that strategic Bitcoin reserve, the path is open for corporations in the United States to recapitalize on Bitcoin. And the path is open for banks to recapitalize on Bitcoin. And now corporations don't have to die. Banks don't have to die. Institutions are already off the hook. Individuals are already off the hook. For an endowment and for a family and for a private company, it's your choice if you choose the asset which is going up 60% a year or the asset which is going down 6% a year. That's your choice. But it was never a choice for the banks in the US. It was never a choice for operating companies in the US. And so what Senator Lummis is doing is really much more profound than we're going to buy some Bitcoin. What she is doing is she is laying the ethical, economic, technical foundation to revitalize the banking system in the US and in the world, all the public companies in the US and then the world, all of the institutions. And she's spreading the American way of life, the American ideology. And what will first happen is America will do it, but eventually every other country in the world, in Europe, in South America, in the Middle East, they will all look at what we're doing and they will follow us in the same way that, when we started building airports and airplanes, they followed us. And when we started embracing electricity, they followed us. And when John D. Rockefeller started, creating gasoline and kerosene, the world wanted to buy it. And the world wanted to buy Henry Ford's automobiles. They're going to want Bitcoin, and they're going to want digital capital. And this is really, it's a pivotal moment in the history of the world. I mean, the Trump, Vance, Musk movement, when we made this choice, are we going to embrace technology and Starlink and electric vehicles and entrepreneurship? Are we going to give the people their freedom back? Are we going to embrace innovation? Right? That choice that took place on Tuesday, November 5th, that catapulted us into a whole new world of possibilities, and that made the strategic Bitcoin reserve possible.